Hi, I'm Stephanie Fox, Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm so very excited to welcome everybody watching tonight, our wonderful screening of The Lobby and our opportunity to hear from some wonderful guests, Kristian Davis-Bailey, Khury Petersen-Smith, and Dr. Rabab Abduhadi. We're going to get to the film shortly and our guests right after that. But first, I want to welcome you all, say I'm so glad you're joining us tonight, and send a special thank you to our co-sponsors for this evening, Palestine Legal, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies at SFSU, Institute for Policy Studies, Adala Justice Project, Center for Constitutional Rights, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, Palestinian Youth Movement, National Students for Justice in Palestine, and USACB. And maybe we can get those links in the chat for those of you watching on YouTube Live. All phenomenal organizations we're incredibly honored to be partnering with this evening. A quick few tech notes. Feel free to be writing comments and questions in the YouTube live stream. We have folks on hand to be moderating and bringing those questions back to our wonderful guests when we do get to the discussion portion of the evening. If you have tech issues, feel free to email membership@jvp.org. And, you know, we don't have a lot of experience on this StreamYard platform. Thank you for experimenting with us tonight. We are exploring it rather than Zoom, in part because Zoom recently censored an event featuring Palestinian activists, including our esteemed guest Rabab Abduhadi. And this is just another example of the shrinking space for Palestinians to advocate for their freedom and rights, so much of which this film will cover this evening. So thanks for being on StreamYard as this experiment with us, and we're excited to move into watching this film. Tonight we'll be watching the film together. I feel happy to be in community with you all, taking in this important film, really, really relevant for the times we're living through. And then we'll move into a question and answer with our guests right after. So do stick around as soon as the film is out. A little bit more about this film we're getting to watch together tonight. In 2016, Al Jazeera sent a young undercover journalist into the DC-based pro-Israel lobby. For 3 months, this reporter, Tony, attended social events and conferences, networked and took meetings with employees of AIPAC, the Israeli Embassy, the Israel on Campus Coalition, Stand With Us, and more. The pro-Israel lobby and its right-wing allies launched a pressure campaign to prevent the release of the film. As a result, Al Jazeera never approved the release of the film, but it was leaked and published on Electronic Intifada in 2018. Organizer and researcher Karen Holmes has produced a 1-hour cut of the 4-hour documentary series focused on the Israel lobby's efforts to target and suppress Palestine solidarity activists and organizing on U.S. college campuses. This is a special cut of the film, and it offers insight into smear campaigns, lawfare projects, Israeli intelligence and domestic surveillance operations, all targeting students and academics. And so we're going to watch this cut of the film. I am so excited to do so with you all. Please stick around. We're going to screen it here. You'll also see streaming along the bottom of the screen the direct link to follow. If you have any tech issues, that may be a slightly higher quality link. So feel free to follow that link or to watch along with me here on StreamYard. And be sure to please stick around. We'll have a lively conversation with our guests right after the film concludes.
Using an undercover reporter, Al Jazeera's investigative unit infiltrates one of the most powerful lobbies in the world.
Getting $38 billion in security aid to Israel matters, which is what AIPAC just did.
We examine how the lobby, led by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has secured unwavering support in Congress.
Congressmen don't do anything unless you pressure them. That is the only way to do that is with money.
What the lobby is all about is to make sure that Israel gets special treatment from the United States forever.
But after occupying Palestinian lands for half a century, the pro-Israel lobby is facing a new challenge.
We called for a full boycott of Israel, divesting from it, and eventually imposing sanctions on it to achieve UN-stipulated rights of the Palestinian people.
A movement to boycott, divest, and impose sanctions on Israel, BDS, was formed on American campuses.
Seems to be achieving its goals, threatens future American support for Israel.
We believe in justice for all people. So that means the occupation has to end.
Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs responded with a covert operation to defeat BDS.
אתה צריך לעשות את זה עם הרבה מאוד עמימות. זה לא גוף צבאי היררכי שאם הרגנו את X, אז כל הגוף מתחתיו לא פועל.
So the Israeli government leverages Jewish organizations in the diaspora.
Absolutely.
It's a psychological campaign involving spying and smears.
You discredit the messenger as a way of discrediting the message.
Just stay on message. And what is that message? BDS is a hate movement.
While our reporter monitored pro-Israel groups, he was asked to go undercover for the lobby.
You're going into enemy territory, not for everybody.
Our undercover reporter, Tony, is British and Jewish and had recently graduated from the University of Oxford. He wrote articles and presented himself as a strong supporter of Israel. In Washington, he attended a course on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
I'm from the UK, and I'm just taking a course at Georgetown here over the summer.
He networked in the social circles of the pro-Israel lobby.
Hi, I'm Rona.
I'm Tony.
Nice to meet you.
Good to see you. I'm good. Good to see you. Hey.
After building his profile, Tony was accepted on a training course in pro-Israel advocacy.
Welcome to Fuel for Truth DC second boot camp. Congratulations, everyone, to being accepted. What we're going to do right now is just kind of like introduce ourselves. I'm Daniel.
In role-play workshops, they were instructed how to respond to criticism of Israel.
And I have a volunteer. Apartheid walls cutting off Palestine. Boycott Israel. Divest from Israel. Sanction companies that do business with Israel.
It's kind of odd to call it a wall, given that like 90% of it is fence.
This is a photo. I see a wall.
Why can't Israel do more to help, Tony?
Our undercover reporter played the role of pro-Israel advocate.
Israel's doing a lot to help the Palestinians. I say actually Israel is doing all the best that they can, but it's a tough situation.
The people, businesses in Gaza can't freely send their trucks into Israel to sell their goods.
I think you'll find that that's actually a misconception. They do allow their trucks, and what they don't allow is dangerous material.
Okay, stop.
After the course, Tony was accepted as a volunteer at a pro-Israel communications group called the Israel Project.
It's Tony Kleinfeld. Kleinfeld. Like Seinfeld, but with a K.
The Israel Project, known as TIP, describes itself on its promotional videos as a strategic communications group.
At TIP, we believe we've found the answer. Israel's enemies have left the battlefield of the Middle East and are now fighting on the battlefield of public opinion.
TIP's online promotion claims it shapes the way Israel is framed in the international media.
TIP changes the way thousands of media reports appear every year. And then we add platforms of our own, getting people talking, taking command of the conversations.
Weeks before he started, Tony discussed with a senior manager how TIP deals with the media.
There are things that you do loudly. A lot of them things you do. It's basically messaging on the following. BDS means essentially a kind of hate group targeting Israel. They're anti-peace. We try not to even use the term just because it builds their brand. We just refer to boycotters. The goal is to actually make things happen and to figure out what are the means of communication to do that.
In 2005, Palestinian civil rights groups sought a peaceful means to protest against Israel's occupation. They identified goods from Israel and called for their boycott. The BDS movement was born.
Adopt a non-violent strategy because we think It is morally consistent and very effective against an enemy that is extremely powerful militarily. We called for boycotting Israel, divesting from it, and eventually imposing sanctions on it, as was done against apartheid South Africa, to achieve basic Palestinian rights under international law.
Over the past decade, BDS has grown around the world. By campaigning for Palestinian civil rights in land controlled by Israel, BDS believes it has exposed a deficiency in the moral defense of the Jewish state. Tony had gathered that the lobby's concern with BDS was not its economic impact, but a much wider threat to the power of the pro-Israel lobby.
The specific potential of an immediate boycott, that's not a problem. It's a bigger problem is the Democratic Party, the Bernie Sanders people, bringing all these anti-Israel people, and the Democratic Party being pro-Israel is less of a bipartisan issue. And then every time the White House changes, policies towards Israel change. And that's a different thing. You know, there is an actually important battle to fight on the campus.
The Israel on Campus Coalition is a coordinating group at the front line of the battle against BDS.
We built up this massive national political campaign to crush them and to fight back and to fight fire with fire. What we saw was a growing global movement to destroy Israel that was manifesting on American college campuses. It makes sense that they would try to poison our next generation. The one thing every member of Congress and president and ambassador and newspaper editor has in common is, by and large, they spent a little bit of time on a college campus, and probably those were formative years.
The Israel on Campus Coalition is at the center of the lobby's response to BDS.
We've got 100, maybe 120 now professionals that are working for a dozen national ICC partner organizations like APAC and Hazara Fellowships and Stand With Us, Hillel and Chabad and API.
The Israel on Campus Coalition, they really oversee like the whole movement. They're sort of the ones that like have the bird's eye view. Let's just say like next week, a BDS resolution comes to campus. So the ICC will be the ones, they'll organize a conference call with all the partners. So they might say, okay, stay with us, we need a little bit more your help because we need something regarding like what's in the BDS resolution. The campus newspaper wants us to write like an op-ed, so you guys help with like the op-ed. So they'll sort of be the ones and they'll sort of be overseeing it.
Stand With Us and the ICC have a particularly close relationship. Stand With Us holds an annual conference in Los Angeles. Its focus is on how to fight the BDS movement.
To reveal the true nature of BDS, a venomous, deceitful, anti-peace, anti-coexistence movement that will settle for nothing short of the annihilation of the Jewish state.
Jacob Bain from the Israel on Campus Coalition linked BDS to the rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes in America.
Anti-Semitism is increasing in general, right? In the same way that we're seeing anti-Semitism increase in the community, we're seeing these awful, terrifying desecrations of Jewish cemeteries. Campus is no exception.
At the Israel on Campus Coalition in Washington, Tony discovered that the lobby is deliberately adopting a clan approach on campuses.
We should stand behind our work in front of it. It's not helpful for Stand With Us to say to a pro-Israel student or the Israel Project to say to a pro-Israel student, oh, sure, we'll help you, but you have to put our logo on it. We're working like so closely with Stand With Us, and we have such a tight partnership with them today that like it's totally seamless.
Tony also discovered that anonymity is a key strand of the campaign against BDS.
If one of these terrorists on campus wants to disrupt a pro-Israel lecture or something and like unfurl a banner or whatever else, we're going to investigate them, look into bad stuff they've done. That stuff becomes very useful in the moment. And there are any number of ways to push it out. The only thing is that we do it securely and anonymously. And that's the key.
It was a Sunday. I was in the kitchen, partner in the living room with my daughter. came in with her laptop and she said, "You've got to see this."
Bill Mullen has been a campaigner for the BDS movement for years. His wife had been sent a link to a website containing a letter addressed to her.
This letter purported to be by a former student who said that she had been sexually harassed by and found other students at Purdue who had had the same experience. She was writing this letter to tell their story.
With the anti-Israel people, what's most effective, what we found, at least in the last year, is you do the opposition research, put up some anonymous website, and then put up targeted Facebook ads.
Within a very short time, within about 48 hours, we were able to establish that these multiple sites that we had found attacking me had been taken out almost at the same time, and that they were clearly the work of the same people.
Every few hours, you drip out a new piece of the opposition research. It's psychological warfare, drives them crazy.
One of the accounts said that in the process of supposedly putting my hand on her, I'd invited her to a Palestine organizational meeting. And I thought, well, you're sort of putting your cards on the table there, whoever you are. We found out that a student at Purdue, who I work with, had also been targeted.
A former activist with Students for Justice in Palestine agreed to speak only with her face concealed.
It said that I would get drunk and go and have sex with multiple guys, and that's just a huge attack on my character and a massive lie. My parents were very upset. They immediately told me to quit my involvement with SJP.
They either shut down or spend time investigating, which time they can't spend attacking Israel. That's incredibly effective.
The main focus was to attack my reputation and my character. Pretty much to mess with me so that I don't want to continue my involvement with SJP.
Could you send me some of these websites? I'd be very curious just to see what they look like.
I couldn't.
You couldn't, okay.
But, Canary Mission is a good example. Canary Mission is highly, highly effective to the extent that we monitor the Students for Justice in Palestine and their allies.
A few years later, these individuals are applying for jobs within your company.
Canary Mission's promotional video threatens to pass these smears on to prospective employers.
Ensure that today's radicals are not tomorrow's employees.
Somebody did contact my employer and ask for me to be fired based on my pro-Palestinism. That, if they continued to employ me, that their values are anti-Semitic. It can be really scary at first. I was mostly harassed via Twitter. They were tweeting me like every 2 or 3 days. They take screenshots even way back to my Facebook pictures that don't even look like me anymore. Just digging and digging through my online presence.
They're terrified of Canary Mission, and it's about time.
We have always been afraid of ending up on there. It was very personal. They see us as such a threat that they have to kind of twist and turn and delve into our personal lives. As if they were trying to scare us into stopping our work. Their Twitter campaign is relentless.
Every picture that I post on Facebook, it goes onto one of their websites with every tweet that I put in. Every hashtag I post on Instagram, it goes into one of their files.
As he left his meeting at the ICC, Tony reflected on the way Jacob Boehm had reacted to his questions about Canary Mission.
We do it securely and anonymously, and that's the key.
It sounds very similar to a Canary Mission kind of thing.
Yeah.
Are you guys in touch with them at all, or is there any kind of
No, Canary Mission is totally anonymous.
Yes. Yeah,
it's hard to figure out who's behind it. Canary Mission is highly, highly effective to the extent that we monitor the Students for Justice in Palestine and their allies. We're doing it better. I mean, not we, but this is an anonymous group.
We don't know who's behind it. I would ask where they get their money from, because ultimately that tells you where the control is.
Our undercover reporter, Tony, is having a coffee with Eric, his boss at the Israel Project. Tony wanted to find out more about Canary Mission.
There's a guy named Adam Milstein who you might want to meet. He's a convicted felon. That's a bad way to describe. He's really local. When I was working with him when I was at APAC, I was literally emailing back and forth with him while he was in jail. But he's loaded. I mean, he's close to $500 million.
Adam Milstein has become a central figure in the lobby. His foundation funds numerous pro-Israel organizations. He also sits on the boards of AIPAC's National Council, the Israel on Campus Coalition, and Stand With Us. Our reporter filmed him alongside Jacob Boehm from the Israel on Campus Coalition at the Stand With Us conference in Los Angeles. The two men had lengthy private discussions. Tony attended the Israeli-American Council's annual conference. At a party, he spotted the IAC's chairman, Adam Milstein.
I'm Tony. I'm in the Israel Project with Eric Gallagher.
Milstein told Tony how critics of Israel should be handled.
First of all, investigate who they are, what's their agenda. They're picking on the Jews because it's easy, because popular. We need to expose what they really are. We need to expose the things that they're anti we believe in. And we need to put them on the right. Right now, they can do whatever they like, terrorize us, and we are...
How do we put them on the wrong, though?
Doing it by exposing who they are, what they are, affect with their racism, affect with their bigot, with their democracy.
Eric said wealthy pro-Israel donors now have the freedom to fight Israel's critics however they want.
In this country, you have these billionaire types who are starting to realize, like, oh, wow, I don't need to participate in the Republican or Democratic parties. I could build my own apparatus and have influence from Los Angeles. Detroit. Now, seems one of these guys. He funds the Israel Project. He does a lot of good work.
Eric then made a remarkable claim when Tony asked about Canary Mission.
All the people involved with them.
It's him.
Adam Milstein.
Yeah, I don't know who he hired to oversee it. Adam Milstein. He's the guy.
We need to expose the things that they're anti everything we believe in. We need to put them on the right.
So Adam Milstein funds the Israel Project and he's funding the Canary Mission website.
Yeah, which is interesting because it makes it seem as though we're a part of it, but we're not. Actually, I was involved with the starting with the name and shame. He called a group of us to ask us what we thought. I told him actually that was a bad idea, but he did it anyway. There's no one on our side doing it, so you don't have to worry about your reputation.
They've lost the political argument. They can now do nothing but resort to personal smears against us. They can't engage us in discussions of the occupation. They can't defend apartheid. They can't defend the bombings in Gaza, but they can try to destroy our lives.
The lobby hope that a new partnership with Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs will become a game changer in the fight against BDS.
The Ministry of Strategic Affairs brings together this group called the Global Coalition for Israel. And it's like leading pro-Israel advocacy groups around the world. My view and the view of Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which we coordinate with sometimes, where we communicate with sometimes, is like Europe is lost and it's basically over. And like they're turning a lot of attention now to the US because they feel we're on your path.
The secretive Ministry of Strategic Affairs, based in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, is given a mission: establish a covert campaign to defeat the BDS movement. The campaign includes monitoring the activities of American students.
We use all sorts of technology. We use corporate level, enterprise grade, and social media intelligence software. Almost all of this happens on social media. So we have custom algorithms and formulae that acquire the stuff immediately.
We are a different government working on foreign soil, and we have to be very, very cautious. We have 3 different sub-campaigns which are very, very sensitive regarding data, gathering, information analysis, working on activist organization, money trail. This is something that only a country with its resources can do the best. If we want to win, we have to change our ways. We have to think differently. This is waging a holistic campaign against the other side. Take him out of his comfort zone. Make him be on the defensive.
The United States, the lobby is working with Israel to spy on American citizens.
We're giving them data. For example, one day, Sima's deputy sending me a photo, just a photo in WhatsApp. You can boycott Israel on a billboard. In a few hours, our systems and analysts could find the exact organization, people, and even their names where they live. We get it back to the ministry. I have no idea what we did with this, but in fact, 3 days later, there were no billboards.
Our undercover reporter was attending a dinner at the annual conference of the Israeli-American Council in Washington. The three-day conference brings together the constellation of pro-Israel lobby groups in the US. On the surface, things seem to be looking good for Israel.
Israel's booming. It's the startup nation. More venture capital is going into Israel today than at any other time in history. So why don't we just calm down, realize that BDS is worthless, it's losing, and ignore it. I don't think BDS was ever supposed to be about getting colleges to take their money out of Israel. So if we focus on the dollars, we can feel really good about ourselves. If we focus on the fact that an effort is being made to distance us, those who love Israel, from the rising generation, I think we need to worry. When you get to the millennials and the students, it's a bad situation. And it's getting to the point now where the majority is more favorable to the Palestinians than the Israelis.
While numerous speakers discussed ways to combat BDS, the lack of civil rights for Palestinians living under Israeli control was not raised.
Nobody talks about the reason why BDS exists at all. What's the model for the BDS movement? The model is South Africa. So was that a bad thing to do?
An apartheid regime which denied equal rights to black South Africans was weakened and ultimately collapsed after a global economic and political boycott.
They're worried that the BDS movement will get to the stature that the South Africa boycott got to. So they're trying to stop it now.
In order to discredit the apartheid label, the lobby has launched a campaign to try to co-opt black South Africans.
Black South Africans who were apartheid activists, who were brought to Israel, saw the reality, came home, and they felt lied to. They felt that someone had tried to steal their narrative. This is an effective tool. Bringing these black South African, former BDS activists, now Israel supporters to American campuses.
During his volunteership, Tony learned that the Israel Project has been developing a strategy called Stop Stealing My Apartheid. The plan is to feed articles written by black South Africans into the American media, claiming that BDS has distorted their history.
If you're disgusted by segregation in this country, if you're disgusted by South African apartheid, then you should also be disgusted by Israeli apartheid.
Another workshop was addressed by Israeli diplomats from consulates in the US. Black Lives Matter had attracted particular criticism after voicing support for the BDS movement. It appears that Israel's diplomats may be trying to challenge the apartheid label by canvassing support amongst African Americans.
The major problem of Israel is with the young generation of the black community. Black Lives Matter starts there. I had last week a dinner, sit-down dinner at my house with 40 people, which are considered the leadership of the Black community, and it's very important people. They can be part of our doing an activity.
Pro-Israel groups are trying to cultivate a new generation of Black leaders that is pro-Israel by bringing them to APEC conferences on all expenses paid trips, by taking them on delegations to Israel.
They're doing that because they're afraid of BDS and they're afraid of Black Lives Matter, which is this new struggle for Black freedom that also sees Black freedom situated in a larger context. 2014, Israel launched a siege of Gaza. In the same summer, police in Ferguson killed Mike Brown, and Ferguson rose up. And on the news at night, there would be both the latest out of Gaza and the latest out of Ferguson. There was solidarity that was expressed online with the Ferguson uprising. There were Palestinians who took to Twitter to cheer on the rebels of Ferguson and explain how to deal with tear gas.
Israel's diplomats have responded by evoking the legacy of Martin Luther King, claiming that the campaign for Palestinian civil rights bears no resemblance to the civil rights movement in America.
Dr. Klein wrote the draft speech for Martin Luther King. I had a dream. He was his lawyer, he was his close friend. He's somebody that I reached out to. He became a very close and personal friend. Because of that relationship, we published 3 articles in the Huffington Post explaining why their agenda was hijacked. Martin Luther King will turn in his grave if he saw the anti-Israel tendencies or policies that are starting to emerge in Black Lives Matter.
There's something on one hand laughable about it, but there's something also really insidious about this. You're using the credibility of a freedom struggle to try to oppose another freedom struggle. And I think that's appalling.
Soon after Black Lives Matter declared support for BDS, a fundraiser at a New York nightclub was suddenly cancelled. The venue's management said it didn't approve of the movement's stance on Israel. Tony was told by his boss, Eric, that the Israel was a fine decision.
I don't know if you saw that this club, ditched a Black Lives Matter event. One of our donors, we just put in a call to him, and then he put in a call to the police.
Wow, shut down this Black Lives Matter event. I think it's really appalling that a system in Israel has devised incredible and comprehensive ways to have a violent regime against Palestinians, that they would also invest resources into making sure to shore up support for that oppression here.
One evening at the IAC conference, Tony met a prominent activist. He's associated with the hardline trend in the pro-Israel lobby. Noah Pollock argues that tough tactics are needed to counter the apartheid label.
The activism has to be very provocative. Total no and we're going to be more pro-Israel than you can even imagine.
Pollock believes the American public, unlike those in Britain, will accept his gloves-off strategy.
The majority of Americans are pro-Israel. Whereas if you never go to the UK, it's just pure patriotism. Your country, basically let half of Pakistan move in, So you have a different problem than we do here.
There is an actual direct connection between the people who were involved in raising money for Hamas and the people who are involved in BDS activism on American campuses today.
Pollock claims that SJP is just a front to hide the real agenda of American Muslims for Palestine.
You'll notice their name is Students for Justice in Palestine. You don't hear the word Islamic, you don't hear the word Muslim in that name, and you hear the word justice, which is kind of a buzzword on campuses today. Everyone's for justice, right? You're not for injustice. The crowd that's kind of behind the scenes is actually a very Islamic radical cause. And if you actually get like into the SJP, aligned with groups that are for the not just destruction of Israel, the destruction of America.
Pollock even accuses Jewish supporters of BDS of being in league with Hamas.
Jewish Voice for Peace, or as I call it, Jewish Voice for Hamas. It'd be like having a group called African Americans for Slavery. It's like, it's crazy, right? A lot of the JVP people not Jewish. They've had a real problem of people basically pretending to be Jews because the anti-Israel activism it's a little more sexy.
You're here speaking with the rabbi. I work for Jewish Voice for Peace. I mean, we're a Jewish organization. I mean, again, I think that's another kind of absurd claim.
When you talk about SJP and when you talk about BDS, you talk about them as a hate group, as a movement that absolutely endorses violence against civilians, not military conflict, but violence against civilians, aka terrorism. You discredit the messenger as a way of discrediting the message.
Tony was told of a demonstration that Noah Pollock was organizing. A bus took protesters to an event organized by the pro-BDS movement, Students for Justice in Palestine.
Hey man, Anthony. Marshall. Nice to meet you.
This is one of those things where either it's going to be amazing when we defeat BDS, or we're just broken.
Well, you can't beat them, join them.
The protesters are on a fellowship program run by a conservative think tank called the Khury Institution.
The whole fellowship is describing as like you guys are being like foot soldiers conservative. This is actually the first foot soldier activity that I think is important to do. Tony, what's your connection to Khury?
Yeah. Project.
So you can't not.
Their plan is to disrupt the National Conference of Students for Justice in Palestine. Marshall said that the pro-Israel protest had been poorly planned.
It's a very fly-by-the-pants procedure. It was basically just like Noah Pollock coming and being like, look, there are these jihadis who basically did suicide bombing, and they're at a campus, and you have to stop them.
So a chance to shot at Arabs?
As we're leaving, we mentioned to our boss yesterday that we're going. She's like, oh yeah, that's mandatory. You need to go.
While they've been told they have to take part in the protest, not everyone on the bus is convinced it's good for their reputation.
Do you know what my worst nightmare is? I'm actually not kidding. It's a photo of Dion and I together, and we're just clearly identifiable. And they're like, "Oh, who are these traitors who sold out to the Jewish conspiracy for money?" I'm like, "We did. We cost $50,000 plus benefits."
As the bus leaves, they discuss whether there's any point in staging the protest.
I'm just skeptical.
Of using the protesting tactic against them?
That's not our demographic. They don't
The reason protests work is when the people involved care about it and want to be there.
When a protest is sponsored and organized by leaders, but to appear like a popular grassroots movement, it's known as astroturfing.
They did a really job of getting me excited to show up and protest.
It kind of, the way you're putting it kind of sounds a bit like astroturfing.
No. This is astroturfing. No, this is actually there's a box.
What does that mean?
This is what you set up things.
It's the difference between grassroots and astroturf.
It's not that astroturfing is wrong. It's just that your astroturf has to be committed.
The bus arrives at George Mason University, where Students for Justice in Palestine is holding its national conference. But the protesters can't find the conference hall.
They just pull over and ask, hey, where are all the jihadis?
The driver sees two students and stops to ask directions. One is wearing a headscarf.
Wait. Oh, no. Come on.
We're back to DC. Back to DC.
I believe the comments said.
Excuse me? Do you know where the Johnson Center is?
Okay, just go back down this. Okay, okay, thank you.
That was problematic.
So this is off to a good start.
Students for Justice in Palestine really is a student-led type of organization focused around promoting the BDS cause. We have workshops on how to run a divestment campaign, finding intersections on campus, building alliances. Right now, Palestine has been essentially normalized on campuses.
The bus finally arrives.
Jen.
Noah Pollock's is the event. To avoid breaking university regulations, he's arranged a legal briefing.
The SJP conference is on the 3rd floor, and we're going to go up and in a respectful and quiet way protest them. Yael is a legal expert and is going to talk a little bit about that.
We are here, of course, as guests of the university. So we don't want to be accused of disrupting a school-sponsored activity. It is against the law to use abusive, violent language. So we're going to use peaceful, good language. If we see that they're doing anything that is bad behavior, don't engage, remain calm. If you do happen to speak with any reporters, just stay on message. What is that message? SJP is a hate group. BDS is a hate movement. The other thing you want to mention is that SJP endorses violence, terrorism, things like that. And you guys are going to be great.
We're not there to provoke. We're not there to have any sort of incident at all. We're nice people.
We start seeing groups of people coming towards us who don't seem familiar, and then brandishing Israel flags and then posters and signs.
Tony joined the demonstration.
No.
Support democratic society, but if you don't watch this, SJP, what do you think of this?
You agree? Child suicide bombers?
How do you respond to such a wild accusation that's not grounded in anything and that's just designed to shift attention? Oh wait, we support suicide bombers. That's ridiculous.
Before that,
social justice left support radical terrorism.
You don't want dialogue?
We're here to talk to you. Turn your back.
You'd think if like they were gonna they'd try to shake it up and mix it up with new accusations.
We don't support radical Islamic terrorism in this country. We don't support suicide bombers. Cowards who kill children and women. They leave orphans. We don't support that.
Kill babies in strollers. That'll bring peace. Yeah, Palestinian terrorists all over Israel. That'll be it.
Real baby killers, these terrorists. They kill women, they kill children, they don't care about anything.
Rape women too, all the time.
It takes a lot to hear this and not respond, and to turn your back to them and to not look back at them.
Thank you, SJP. Good luck with your jihad.
They were very frustrated at the fact that we weren't responding. They're saying, "You're not even responding. They're not even responding."
Look at how they wave the Palestinian flag in our country. Look at this. These are the real basket of deplorables. These are the deplorables, people. They cower behind radical Islamism. They don't engage in dialogue because they can't win the war of ideas.
There's no responding to our content because there is no refuting our content. Our content is grounded in human rights, morality, ethics, international law.
The staged protest had minimal impact on the students at George Mason University. But the headlines shared on social media tell the story Pollock wanted.
Yeah, let's head back to headquarters for debriefing cocktails.
Tony was attending a party run by an advocacy group that he'd joined. A journalist then approached him with an extraordinary proposition. He wanted Tony to work undercover for the lobby at a meeting of BDS activists.
for the Allgemeiner, so we're trying to recruit someone to go undercover just to go there and just see what's going on. And I think we're sort of get paid for it too. Yeah. Sort of sign up, profile, just kind of like see what's going on. Higher up, they got some data. It's the only one who can do this. For some reason, he pops in my head.
A few days later, a journalist from the Allgemeiner contacted Tony.
It would be undercover and has to be kept pretty quiet. We would like to have some recording device on your person. Any level of potential danger or difficulty, violence or verbal assault, none of that concerns you or puts you off?
No, because I think I'm pretty good at just being kind of zen in the face of verbal assaults.
The Allgemeiner claims to be the fastest growing Jewish newspaper in America. It pays particular attention to events on college campuses.
We're working on a project now about ranking U.S. universities and colleges in terms of their anti-Semitic and anti-Israel activity. We have a campus bureau that monitors this sort of behavior and these incidents and these campaigns all day long, all week long.
The Allgemeiner often reports that anti-Semitism exists amongst pro-Palestinian student groups.
The language that comes from those arenas move into that sphere of the new anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israelism. And that's a big focus at the Campus Bureau, looking at the blurring of those lines and where those boundaries have eroded. As journalists, right, exposure is the goal, exposing truth.
A short time later, the Allgemeiner contacted Tony once more to discuss his proposed mission to work undercover at a BDS event. The editor explained what they wanted.
One of the projects that we've been looking to do for quite a while is to try and infiltrate some of these groups, get undercover and discover what they're about from the inside. You explain more the hostile environment and there's some risk involved. The goal would really be to uncover any evidence of not just past, but real bigotry, a correlation between the BDS movement and picture of Jews.
Tony is given a list of persons of interest. They're all on the Canary Mission website.
Go to canarymission.org. Have you heard of Canary Mission?
A little bit. You tell me that.
People who hate it, the people who are being targeted by it, call it a blacklist. You have names here that show up on this database. Students and professors, faculty, speakers, organizations that have ties to terrorism, outright ties to terrorism, or terrorists who have called for the destruction of the Jewish state.
Despite running Canary Mission Tennessee expose, the Allgemeiner staff say Canary's identity is still a mystery.
It's an anonymous site. Nobody has any idea who's actually running this thing, and people have tried to look into it.
If you're on board in terms of the concept, then I guess the next thing we just need to figure out the money. Can we wait for a follow-up email from you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I should get that to you within the next 24 hours.
In August 2016, a story in the Allgemeiner caused waves in Washington's pro-Israel circles.
The thing that I'm working on, you might have seen the news recently about us school of anti-Semitism at the University of Tennessee. The expose was on these anti-Semitic tweets. They uncovered 14 current students, 5 recent graduates at the University of Tennessee that had tweeted all of these horribly anti-Semitic things.
The evidence was released by an anonymous group within the pro-Israel lobby.
They're called Canary Mission.
The University of Tennessee is based in Knoxville, a quiet city in the east of the state. Tennessee is conservative and religious. The Christian church has political influence here. 6 out of 10 voters opted for Donald Trump. At the university, students and professors, including opponents of BDS, were taken up by the headlines.
It said that there was rampant anti-Semitism at the University of Tennessee. This was quite a shock. It was very surreal and strange. I didn't see anything happening on the ground. It all seemed to be internet-based.
This international headline with our names and this defamation of our characters, it was the last thing that we were expecting to happen.
I was surprised that they were targeting the University of Tennessee. I mean, there's just not a whole lot going on in Knoxville. It just seems such a benign target.
Several tweets were clear-cut examples of anti-Semitism. Some failed to distinguish between Jewish people and the State of Israel. Others made vile references to the horrors of the Holocaust.
There were definitely some very anti-Semitic things said, but it seemed to be by a limited number of students.
Those tweets are horrible, and that should not be supported by anybody.
One of the students, there were tweets from when they were 14, 15, and 16 years old. People do and say stupid things. I was really horrified that you had essentially this blacklist of students.
Shortly after being named by Canary Mission, posters and flyers linked BDS supporters to Hamas.
There was a list of most of the names of the students that were mentioned in the Canary Mission. All I kept seeing were flyers all over the place. Like they'll put it on cars, they'll put it on side tables in the student centers and stuff like that.
That kind of scared me, to think that there are actually people physically on campus posting these things.
Back in Washington, Aviva is drafting a letter to the University of Tennessee on behalf of the Brandeis Center. They want the university to take a stand.
We're telling them that basically they need to issue a stronger statement. They need to investigate the students that were involved. They need to offer education and training.
In addition to drawing attention to those responsible for anti-Semitic tweets, their orchestrated release served a purpose, part of a wide campaign by the pro-Israel lobby.
The problem right now on universities is that administrations don't realize that anti-Israel statements or anti-Zionist statements often are also anti-Semitic.
To find out what anti-Semitism means for the lobby, Tony visits Aviva's boss at the Brandeis Center for Human Rights in Washington. Despite its name, it's a pro-Israel lobby group.
Hi. It's great to finally meet you. Really good to meet you.
Kenneth Marcus is involved in the lobby's attempt to redefine anti-Semitism in a way that could include criticism of the State of Israel.
The goal is to have the federal government to establish a definition of anti-Semitism that is parallel to the State Department definition.
The US State Department defines anti-Semitism using a three-point test known as the 3 Ds. It includes statements that demonize Israel, those that apply double standards, or those that delegitimize the state.
There have been attempts by some to try to define anti-Semitism in such a way that conflates actual anti-Semitism with completely legitimate criticism of Israel or Israeli government policies. They are overly broad and vague to the point where any kind of criticism of Israel or of Israeli government policies can be labeled as anti-Semitic.
The letter that Aviva was sending called for the University of Tennessee, Knoxville to address a long-standing problem of anti-Semitism on campus. The Brandeis Center is urging American universities to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that could include criticism of Israel.
We're trying to get universities to adopt a uniform definition, whether it's the State Department's definition or a similar version of it, because then we think that the administrators would be able to understand anti-Semitism better and discipline students for hateful and discriminatory actions.
In 2015, Tennessee became the first state legislature to condemn BDS. It's the result of the lobby's attempt to use legal means to quell BDS on campus.
In recent light of anti-Semitic things that have happened here in Tennessee on our college campuses, we are just expressing our support as an ally for the state of Israel. And with that, I renew my motion.
There's an intensive effort by Israel and pro-group, governments, universities, legislative bodies to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel and its state ideology, Zionism. According to their definition, if I say to you that I believe that instead of separate Israeli and Palestinian states, there should be a single state where Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, everyone has full equal rights, the way they do under the Constitution of the United States, that would make me an anti-Semite because I'm denying Israel's right to be a Jewish state. This has been a key goal of people like Kenneth Marcus and the Brandeis Center, so that they can then go after people who are advocating for equality and bring them up on charges that they're actually anti-Semitic bigots.
You have to show that they're racist hate groups and that they are using intimidation to get funded and to consistently portray them that way.
6 months after the Allgemeine ran its report, an anti-Semitism awareness bill was brought before Tennessee's State Assembly. The bill incorporates the 3Ds definition, which can include criticism of Israel. Kenneth Marcus gave evidence.
I had read a newspaper article in a major national Jewish newspaper indicating some issues. We independently verified several different issues going on with blogging, I think it was Facebook entries, Nazi-type references to Jews, and the need to kill Jews. They may have dealt with that. But it seems to me it's an indication that the problem is here.
In order to create enough sort of political momentum and hysteria to get these bills through, you need to show that anti-Semitism is rife on campuses. You see groups like the Brandeis Center jumping on headlines which are very dramatic and very scary. Incidents like the one that they claimed happened at the University of Tennessee are certainly helpful in a political sense if you're trying to push legislation like that through.
A right to exist.
Aviva Vogelstein also traveled to Tennessee.
If a student on a campus says, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, meaning that from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there will be no state of Israel, that would be considered anti-Semitic. Another example would be when students on campus chant things like, Intifada, Intifada, we support the Intifada. That calling for an Intifada is calling for violence against innocent Israeli civilians. And that is an indictment to violence. And it's calling for demonization, delegitimization of Israel.
7 months earlier, when Aviva was writing the letter to the University of Tennessee, she was talking to a leader of the Jewish community in Knoxville. It seems that she told Aviva that the University of Tennessee doesn't have a long-standing problem of anti-Semitism.
She's like, I've been on campus for 10 years and there have been no actual incidents of anti-Semitism. These tweets are obviously disgusting and need to be addressed. It's very misleading that they're calling this a cesspool of anti-Semitism.
Jewish students at the University of Tennessee repeated this sentiment before the state legislature.
When people say things like we're experiencing anti-Semitism, it hits us pretty hard. When we were told that this was being said about our university and the climate at our university, we were really confused because we had never heard any form of anti-Semitism that was happening on our campus. So this is kind of, the first thing to come to us. So if we're the students who are supposed to have been affected by this so-called climate, you would think we would kind of know about it before.
I think it's important to highlight that any allegations that the bill is based off of, those allegations are purely external allegations, meaning they're coming from all over the country except for Tennessee.
One of the consequences of the allegations of anti-Semitism has been to temper activism for Palestinian equal rights.
I would say last year, this time, we had a new sort of like adrenaline underneath us. And then this kind of completely killed our fire. And it was hard to gain that momentum once again.
After Aviva spoke to Jewish students in Tennessee, she also learned that their greatest concern is unrelated to pro-Palestinian activism.
PDS is not a real movement on the campus. Students for Justice in Palestine, which has like a large following nationwide, has like very few active student members. We mostly have problems with Christians who proselytize the Jewish students because in itself, everyone is so like evangelical.
I find it incredibly troubling that at a time when we see a rise in real broad daylight anti-Semitism in the United States, there are those who claim, oh yeah, we're trying to stop anti-Semitism, but what they're actually trying to do is stop advocacy for Palestinian human rights.
Our investigation into the role of the Israeli state at US campuses led Tony to an employee at the embassy in Washington. She's American, and her job is to analyze BDS activity for the Israeli government.
So like nobody really knows what we're doing, but mainly it's been a lot of like research, like monitoring BDS things and reporting it back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and like making sure everyone knows what's going on.
Julia was president of the pro-Israel group at Davis, which is part of the University of California. Davis began as a center for agricultural studies, and its students are known as Aggies.
I came to UC Davis, which had a reputation of being like really pro-Israel. Now it's like the top 5 most anti-Israel schools in the U.S.
Why is that?
Because of everything that happened in the last few years. It was just particularly bad. And there's a huge Muslim population in Sacramento, which is right next to Davis.
The growing support for the BDS movement in Davis and the lobby's response to it is part of a narrative that's unfolding across America's campuses. Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, brought a divestment motion before the Student Senate.
I was very, very nervous. The entire room was filled. I think we had about 600 students and people from the community coming in to witness this vote.
I am here today because, quite frankly, I am ashamed. I am ashamed of my university for supporting apartheid and of my people in Palestine.
Julia and her pro-Israel allies had already decided that they didn't want to debate.
At 4 a.m. the night before, me and my team were like, you're going to leave the walkout. And I was like, okay. And they're like, we're going to film it just for our own purposes. I was like, totally cool. So when everything was happening, like we went into it knowing we were going to lose. Our strategy was how to like ultimately win while losing the vote.
Good evening. My name is Julia Riggin, and I'm the president of Aggies for Israel.
Students streamed the hearing online. The pro-Israel group also filmed it with another purpose in mind. Their videos would play a key part in the story that was to unfold in the days ahead.
We have been ignored and disrespected year after year, but we have never been silenced. We are a beacon of peace and inclusion on a campus plagued by anti-Semitism. This is our victory. And we who are victorious need not legitimize the words spoken in this empty hearing. So if you are here tonight in opposition to this resolution, I invite you now to stand up, really stand up, and join me in walking out.
Our thought was to control the narratives by having the speech. Like we wanted it to cause attention. We wanted everyone to see us walking out to show that like this doesn't represent us or we're shit about this. So that's how we kind of formulated it. That day, all of us released like 50 op-eds in major news sources so that when people made a hashtag and like a whole thing trending, so when people opened their Facebooks, it wouldn't be them celebrating their victory, it would be us sharing our stories. A student senator who's Muslim made a Facebook status saying like Israel will fall, like Sharia law is taking over Davis, like we love Hamas, like that kind of status. So that happened.
We had been called terrorists and told that we were Hamas sympathizers, that we want to bring Sharia law to campus and things like that.
Hi everyone, my name is Azka Fayaz. I'm a second-year political science major.
Azka Fayaz was a committed BDS activist and claimed that pro-Israel students repeatedly tried to link her to political violence.
They just came up to me and said, "You're a terrorist. Are you a terrorist? You're going to bring, terrorism to the student government and things of that nature."
Vote smart. I know her. It was ironic. She was directly making a joke of that. When I saw it, though, given the climate at the time, I did grow concern.
People who were involved, they were like, "Hey, there's actually a lot of negative postings on social media. They're sharing your picture and a cover photo with your caption. It's turning really ugly." That caption was reposted and retweeted over and over and over again. I knew that something was sort of going to happen.
Pro-Israel students were taunted by pro-Hamas students after an anti-Israel vote passed on campus. Listen and watch. And right after the vote passed, a student senator posted this on Facebook. Hamas and Sharia law have taken over UC Davis BRB, crying over the resilience.
Anger and tension running high at the University of California Davis campus. What you just saw played out late last week as the Student Government Association voted on a resolution to boycott the Jewish state of Israel.
They kept showing it over and over again. And then they just said that the Muslim students forced the pro-Israel students to leave the room.
Reports say when the Israel supporters tried to object to this vote, the pro-Palestinian students you just saw tried to shout them down with cries of Allahu Akbar.
I invite you now to stand up. Really, stand up. And join me and walk out.
Of course, we know that they left willingly, and they stated that they were going to walk out of the room.
It's incredible to hear Allahu Akbar shouted in the middle of this university.
And what does that represent, Megan? The subjugation of women, the torture of homosexuals, the torture of Christians, the crucifixion of that's what has come to represent. And that's what they're shouting.
Were you in touch with the embassy, or were you in touch with any groups?
Pretty much all of the groups, not the embassy, I guess our consulate.
As well as the Israeli consulate in San Francisco, Julia's anti-BDS campaign had the guidance of several pro-Israel lobby groups.
Stand With Us helped us a little bit in terms of actual research on the speech. They gave us legal type stuff. I'm always biased and want to work with AIPAC, so they kind of helped more moral support. And David Project helped us a little bit. It was more help gaining contacts in the media world. I guess we needed money to pay for somebody to film the speech.
Despite the passing of the BDS motion, the governors of the university, known as regents, are under no obligation to abide by the students' vote.
As for that resolution to boycott Israel, well, UC Regents issued a statement saying they will not even entertain the idea.
After looking back on everything, I feel a little creepy because of what happened after the vote. People that were affiliated with the group just were smeared and had to deal with these very personal crises of the world calling us terrorists and the world thinking that we were this spiteful hate group. It's pretty unequivocal how organized they were, how brutal and ruthless that narrative was, and how it affected us in the end.
Outside AIPAC's 2017 annual conference, the first protesters were American Jews. AIPAC is facing a challenge from the constituency whose views it was formed to represent.
You do not represent the best of the Jewish prophetic tradition, and we here to bear witness.
One of the groups involved was Jewish Voice for Peace.
The work that Jewish Voice for Peace does is grounded in Jewish tradition, the most basic Jewish and human values that every single person has inherent worth and dignity, should be treated with respect. We then see what's happening to Palestinians, the occupation, the displacement, inequality, and say we need to end those things.
There were few pro-Israel demonstrators. Most wanted to project their strength through Israel's relationship with the United States. The Jewish Defense League, with its distinctive yellow insignias, was a small but threatening presence. Its members later attacked a Palestinian-American man. I can't breathe! I can't! American Jews are even taking the protest to Jerusalem. The Israeli government official who launched a covert campaign to spy on American citizens recognizes that Israel is facing a generational time bomb.
אנחנו היום, לא רק שאיבדנו את הדור השני של היהודים, שזה דור המילניום של היהודים, אני שומעת את זה מההורים שלהם שבאים להיפגש איתי ומסבירים לי כמה קשה להם בארוחות שישי לילדים שלהם. שלא מכירים במדינת ישראל ולא רואים בנו איזה אנטיטי שצריך להריץ אותו.
Wow. It has been a minute since I saw that, and I haven't seen this cut before, so I'm just like taking it in. That was phenomenal. How are y'all feeling? That's a lot. People are coming back from the live stream, so we'll just take a minute and then we'll get into our questions. But wow, right? Like I'm sort of, it's like, for me, I'm like, I remember back to each of those moments, like supporting students or like watching the headlines break and thinking about media or whatnot, right? And to really dig into the other side of it and understand that, it just, you think you know it, but then to see it all play out so directly.
Well, the thing too is like when you're an oppressed person, you know that the system is against you, but usually you don't get your oppressors caught on tape, like detailing how they're organized against you. And that's what's really striking about this.
Yeah, like the callous, like the joking, the laughing, the offhand comments, like just like is so, it's so vile. It's hard. It's kind of hard to watch, actually.
And it's so calculated. They're like, okay, so we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and here's how we do this. And,
and it's all intended to actually instill submission, subjugation, and defeat. I mean, to tell people we are so powerful, we're going to crush you, we're going to destroy you, and to tell anybody who's in solidarity, don't even bother, this is a losing movement. To tell everybody else, to tell anti-Zionist Jews that, look, you don't really have a stand because you're not valid in your own community. To tell people in communities of color that, why are you even bothering with this? This is not something that concerns you. And they're all very racist, very colonialist, very white supremacist, very oppressive discourses, every single one of them. And you can just trace them and you say, this is what's going on. And I've been, I've experienced the Israeli war in Lebanon in 1982. I've experienced what happened when we were organizing it around Sabra and Shatila. All of these things, I mean, I've lived them, and I lived them as somebody who grew up under occupation. I mean, day in and day out, you see this again and again and again. And you keep trying to go to one place and you get blocked. You go to the second place, you get blocked. You go to the third place, you get blocked. And then you have to kind of like take a deep breath and say, you know what? Tomorrow is another day. I'm going to wake up tomorrow. I'm going to smile, because it's just, the thing is that we're not alone. We're not alone. The whole world is committed to the indivisibility of justice, including justice for Palestine. So I think that's like something that actually really keeps all of us going. And I think this is why, you know, we're here. So yeah, they keep coming again and again, and a lot of.
Sure. And hi, everybody. Yeah, so this film brings up a lot because it kind of chronicles the transition from me being part of Students for Justice in Palestine to eventually graduating and joining Palestine Legal 2 years ago, and just the wide landscape of changes that we've seen in that time. But my first reaction is that as a young member of the Black community, I am very proud to be part of the major problem for Israel right now, which is the resurgence of Black solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. And yeah, I mean, Khury and Rabab already spoke to this, but just the racism from the Israel lobby and Zionists is so very clear. Like I caught track of racism against Palestinians, against Arabs, Muslims, Pakistanis, Black people, women, and even other Jewish people. And every person that was involved in these actions appeared to be of European descent. And that really brings home to me how Zionism is a manifestation of European colonialism and of white supremacy. And how willing Zionists are to throw other marginalized groups under the bus in order to maintain power. And so it's tempting to get caught up in the negativity of the film, but I think that if we had spent an hour watching a supercut of all the amazing organizing that SJPs have been a part of, that community groups have been a part of, that teachers have been a part of, we'd be feeling a lot differently right now. So I just want everybody to kind of understand that. But for me, the film marks a shift, a decisive shift in a moment of the movement kind of being on the offensive, moving to the defensive. So between 2008 and 2014, we saw the growth of SJPs across the country, many successful divestment campaigns and resolutions, particularly on the West Coast, which is where I was based as a student, with groups like SJP West coordinating across the entire state to empower students in our various divestment campaigns. Following this period, which kind of culminates in the 2014 summer, or just after the summer of 2014, with the peak of Gaza and Ferguson protests, where we see the resurgence of intersectionality in on-campus politics. This is where we begin to see things like Canary Mission and all these attacks putting us on the defensive. And I thought that the best way to kind of illustrate how this operates is talking through my own experiences as a student at Stanford and a member of our SJP. So let me just see if I can share the screen with you, and I can. Okay, so this is what the Israel lobby was afraid of. They were afraid of students organizing, not just for Black Lives Matter and for civil rights, but for Palestinian rights as well. And so for us at Stanford, we were actually part of a large coalition that included and was driven by Black students, Latino students, Muslim, Native American, just everybody was kind of involved in this process. And we saw a very wide range of efforts by the Israel lobby to silence us, which included offering a professor from the Hoover Institute that was mentioned in the film offering a free dinner to members of the Student Senate to talk about divestment. It included support from the Israeli consulate in San Francisco, Stand With Us, AIPAC, J Street, the David Project. And it also included a former Israeli military official who was paid to work at Stanford's Hillel, coordinating what was supposed to be a student campaign of pro-Israel students against our own divestment campaign. And so what happened in this coalition is that we managed to convince the Stanford University Senate to endorse divestment from the occupation. We put forth one of the largest student petitions on campus in recent history. And we saw how just the various machinations against us in that moment. And so when we see all of these kind of repressive measures that the lobby takes, we have to remember that we are more powerful than that. Like, look at what was operationalized against a bunch of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old students. And look who came out victorious in that. It wasn't the former IDF soldier or IOF soldier, it was the students who were able to push for human rights. So what I hope people understand is that the movement continues and the movement is still strong despite these efforts to silence us. And we see this last week, for example, or 2 weeks ago, when Columbia University passed a divestment resolution. And at the same time, UIUC in Southern Illinois also was able to pass a divestment resolution. And this is despite many of these efforts. So it's also important to understand that. So, for example, I was in the first class of Canary Mission enrollees, if you will, and it was terrifying. But I discovered that there's an entire movement infrastructure that's willing to support students as they graduate and move into the workforce, including groups like JVP or Palestinian Youth Movement, National SJP, and even Pallegal, where I was able to mention Canary Mission in my cover letter. So it's just, again, important to understand that we can't be silenced by these efforts against us. Since this film is several years old, I want to talk about what's changed in the last few years, particularly since the Trump administration came to be. And this is from what we've seen at Palestine Legal. So we obviously saw the growth of Canary Mission, but we also learned a year after this film came out, who the funders of that were, who include Adam Milstein and some of the Jewish federations in San Francisco and Los Angeles. We saw the expansion of former Israeli Mossad agents spying on BDS activists in New York. Kenneth Marcus, who was portrayed in the film as a member of the Brandeis Center, moved from that position into the Trump administration, working in the Department of Education, where he was able to operationalize the very claims that he was pushing as an outside lobbyist, or kind of against student advocacy and calling it anti-Semitic. We also see the formalization of the redefinition of anti-Semitism, which is used as a tool to censor Palestine advocacy. And so this was kind of crystallized last December when Trump signed an executive order adopting this definition for federal agencies, or recommending that it be used in federal agencies. And so one thing that Palestine Legal wants everyone watching to understand is that this executive order does not impact your right to organize, your rights to speak, your rights to teach, to protest, to boycott for Palestinian rights, or criticize Israel cannot be restrained by this executive order. It's all protected under the Constitution. But we have seen, since this order came into being, an uptick in federal complaints and investigations against campus Palestine advocacy. So I had at least 6 of these incidents in mind since December of 2019, which include 2 complaints at Columbia, 2 at UCLA, one of which involves National SJP, the other one of which involves a lecture that Rabab gave 2 years ago last year. The case I want to highlight is an incident at Bard College, where last year students interrupted a very anti-Palestinian speaker for her comments and were accused of anti-Semitism because the speaker was Jewish. The students went through a months-long investigation where they were just scared of how the university would treat their protest. And eventually were cleared of any wrongdoing because they were protesting for human rights and because it was protected free speech. However, despite the university clearing them of these allegations, the Trump administration's Department of Education opened up an investigation into the incident earlier this year, which is ongoing. So I want to end just by highlighting a few stories of resilience and current struggles that are happening. We'll hear a little bit later about the incident that happened at San Francisco State with Professor Abdulhadi. I want to lift up what's happening at CUNY Law right now, where a second-year law student, Nurdin Kiswani, is currently being attacked by an intentional kind of misrepresentation of a social media post that she made. And so one of the groups that has targeted her is this app called Acts.il, which is partially funded by the Israeli government and has thousands of followers that it directs to send emails to campus administration, such as San Francisco State or CUNY Law. And in this particular case, the former Israel fellow at Stanford, who was trying to organize against divestment, took on a role later and leading these online missions for ACT.IL. So there's a very clear kind of connection between how campus advocacy happens and then how the Israel forces try to fight against it. What else do I want to name here? I mean, just in ending, the whole purpose of these efforts is to try to stop our activism, to make it feel too costly or too scary to engage in advocacy for Palestinian freedom. And this is the case not just for Palestine, but for across movements, for indigenous liberation, for Black liberation, for environmental justice, for immigrant rights. And so our best response is to stay the course, continue the work that we're doing, to understand that we are grounded in what Rabab refers to as the indivisibility of justice, and that we just need to keep building our relationships, strengthening the networks that we already have, and trusting that our organizing and our love for freedom and justice will prevail. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you for those thoughts and that framing and like history lesson, really taking us from kind of before the film through the film period and to now. I think it's such brilliant framing for us to really stay focused, understand the risks and the threats, but stay unafraid and stay clear on what we're doing. And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kristian. And folks who have questions for our panelists, this is fun. Please continue to add them in the comments, and we'll hope to have a little time at the end to hear from the panelists on what you're curious about. I am so excited now to introduce Khury Petersen-Smith, who's the Michael Ratner Fellow, Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He researches and writes about U.S. militarism and foreign policy in the Middle East, with special focuses on the struggle for Palestine and the war on terror, and is also a founding member of Black for Palestine. Khury, it's so great to have you tonight. In the film, by the way, you were spectacular in. Thank you so much. It's like our celebrity here tonight. In the film, you talk about the relationship between Palestinian and Black liberation. How do the counterinsurgency methods that impact the groups acting in solidarity with Palestine and BDS? Just walk us through that a little bit more would be great.
Sure. And I have to say thank you so much for organizing this. I'm so grateful for this film. We were saying earlier, oppressed people who are marginalized, we know that institutions and systems are against us, but we don't often have the opportunity to see the people at the helms of those institutions or carrying out oppression talk about it on tape. And so this film is really so powerful. It's such a gem. And thank you so much to the organizers of this event. And so while it's really heavy, the content of this film, my heart is really full actually to be here and to be talking with you all. And of course, the methods that we saw in this film are absolutely devastating for individual activists. I mean, the whole purpose that they're really designed to intimidate people, to dissuade people from being active, and also to set those who are targeted as examples, right? So those who are interested in learning more about Palestine and in being in solidarity with Palestine, the whole idea is to intimidate those people by targeting those of us who are out in front and unabashedly voicing our solidarity with Palestine and for Palestinian freedom. We know that in this place called the United States, for those of us who grew up here, this is changing, I think, in a number of ways, and a lot's being revealed, and I want to talk about that in a bit. But the conversations, when we talk about Palestine and Israel, what we hear is it's just too complicated. These people have been fighting for thousands of years. You can't possibly understand, and therefore don't even try, which is another way to dissuade people from getting involved. So, that's what people kind of have
in their minds. I mean, those of us who are not Palestinians, you know, those of us whose introduction to the injustice taking place in Palestine are the dominant ideas of this country, which are Zionist ideas. You know, that's kind of what's in our minds already. And then we see what's happening in the world. We see the way Israel operates. We see the Israeli violence, the one-sided Israeli violence. We say, wait a minute, hold on. Maybe actually this isn't that complicated. I mean, of course, everything, you know, there are layers of things to learn, but maybe actually the question of where I stand on this isn't actually that complicated. And so solidarity with Palestine can really be quite straightforward. And the purpose of this kind of intimidation is to dissuade you. You know, even if you find yourself in sympathy or solidarity with the Palestinians, there's a price to pay. And so you shouldn't become active. And of course, there are people in our movement, Palestinians first and foremost, but other comrades who stand with Palestinians who pay heavy prices, actually, for our solidarity. But there's another impact of the kind of counterinsurgency that I want to talk about too, and it is, of course, its opposite. That kind of pressure, that the institutional pressure of power, you know, what we saw in this film, that also can have an effect of actually raising bigger questions about precisely that, about institutional power. I mean, if you say, okay, well, it seems like there's an injustice in Palestine. It seems like Palestinians are on the receiving end of that injustice, and I want to offer solidarity with them. And then you get hit, you know? I mean, the example in the film of after the movement for Black Lives voiced solidarity with Palestine, identified the violence against Palestinians as one of the things that we should oppose, and actually US support for Israeli violence as something we should oppose, right? Once the movement for Black Lives did that, Black Lives Matter organizations and activists found themselves paying a price. And the example in the film, one of the examples in the film, is an event in New York City being canceled all of a sudden, right? That Black Lives Matter activists were organizing. All of a sudden, that event is canceled once it's clear that those activists stand with Palestine. And that kind of thing provokes more questioning. So people say, well, wait a minute. I mean, certainly that was my experience when I learned about Palestine and decided that I knew enough to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, and then faced a wave of harsh reaction. It actually pushed me further. I was like, well, wow, okay. It seems like this is actually even deeper than I thought. And that is another impact, to answer your question, that's another impact of the kind of counterinsurgency, is that it can push people further into solidarity. So that is, you know, that's the silver lining, I think, is that there's a certain revelation. And I think that this time that we're living in is a revelation of so many things. I think of the really deep structures and institutional power, powers of how the whole world works, but particularly this country, and for those of us who are located here. And I think that US support for Israel and what the Israeli project is are things that are also being revealed. And I think that, you know, that revelation, it actually highlights one thing that I think comes across in the documentary, which is it's not only the incredible resources at the disposal of Zionist organizations, of course, the resources of the US state, of the Israeli state, which end up being deployed against teenage college students, you know, and others, right? It's not just the abundant resources, but actually there's a certain panic that they have, and a certain kind of desperation, actually, because they are they're losing control. I think they've really lost control of the narrative, and that narrative is really important. I've just been reflecting a lot about how there are all sorts of horrendous governments and colonizing projects all around the world that the United States supports, all kinds of state violence that the US supports. But US support for Israel is unique in a number of ways. And one of those ways is actually that unlike many other states, it has been a feature of US support for Israel is a certain amount of support within the US population, right? So that it's not just that the US government is aiding Israel, but that is supposedly, the claim can be that that is actually speaking in the name of people in this country who want that kind of thing. And as that is waning, as that is falling away, as they're no longer able to say, we speak for young people when we support Israel, because the fact is, everybody knows that college campuses are bastions of support for Palestine at the moment, and are havens for Palestine solidarity organizing, right? It means that these other tactics of intimidation, of pressure, of accessing power to hurt people, to disorganize and disrupt, that is what they rely on. And so in a weird way, I think that we should actually take that as a testament of our power, a testament really of the power of Palestinian resistance, the resistance of people who have refused to be forgotten, first and foremost, and also what we have been able to build in solidarity here in this place and around the world is so powerful that they are really quite afraid, and that is a very good thing.
I love the way you're able to take us both into the violence of the tactics, but also actually how strong and resilient our movements are. And that actually leads me to want to hear you talk a little bit more about the visions and hope you have for the strengthening of this cross-movement solidarity, and like what's the horizon? Where do we go from here? What can we imagine together?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I really do. On one hand, these are such dark and heavy times in so many ways, but I really think those horizons are broader, than we can even imagine. I guess collectively, our imagination is quite powerful, but as individuals, right, it can be very challenging in this moment. But there are possibilities that I think that extend beyond, what may be in front of us. And I'll respond to your question by talking about this year and this summer, because I think that I'm just thinking about the Black-led uprisings that have shaken this country and have had impact well beyond the borders of this place. And, when I think about solidarity, I think about conversations with Palestinian comrades, all kinds of comrades, for whom the Palestinian struggle for liberation is really key. But I think about Palestinian comrades in particular, who I remember talking with at the beginning of the summer, as this uprising, this Black-led uprising was unfolding here in this place, while at the same time, what was looming was what the Israelis called annexation, which we know is actually the colonization of Palestinian land is an ongoing thing. It isn't just like some government policy that's announced, on a certain date. It's a whole set of policies and practices every single day. But, what was looming was an escalation of that violence, right? And so I remember talking to Palestinian comrades who were like, I'm so moved. I want to be in solidarity with this Black struggle. And also, I know that things are rough in Palestine and they're about to get more difficult, right? And I remember we just having these conversations, and we had these conversations in Black for Palestine, and I remember having them with comrades in Jewish Voice for Peace. Like, how do we, of course, like we are in these streets, as part of this uprising against anti-Black racism, but also how do we have the capacity to do that and also do the really critical work of continuing to call attention to the Israeli violence in Palestine and the Palestinian resistance, right? And I feel like actually, my sentiment, and I can't speak for all of us, was that that orientation on the Black-led uprisings, which were so necessary and around which there was a lot of heaviness, but also so much hope. I mean, they totally shifted the trajectory of of the conversation in this country, and I would argue of this country. It was totally shifted by those uprisings, and actually, like it felt to me that it was like a preparation, you know, for what was to come. It expanded our capacity, actually, you know, and as Black uprising has done. You know, it also called attention. It also revealed more of the linkages between the violence that we experience here in this country and Israeli violence. So, you know, my point is there was, and this I think often comes up when we talk about solidarity, right? Like, because there are so many struggles that are really critical. There are so many examples of horrendous oppression, and how can we, you know, you can feel like you have to make a choice, like either, you know, you can be in solidarity with the Black-led uprising, or you can be in solidarity with Palestine. And I think that this year has shown us that's just not true. That actually solidarity, it mutually amplifies, you know, the best of all of our struggles. It expands our capacity and it expands our ability. And so that I want to carry that when I think about being hopeful about the present and the future.
I will carry that too. Thank you for that gift of that perspective. So brilliant and so timely and needed. I love the call to just, and I think it feels so true, this expansion of capacity of our movements. And, you know, I feel like both you and Kristian are offering this sort of other side of the story, right? So this film takes us to this very grim one side. I'm so grateful for that perspective. Thank you, Khury, so much. And we are excited to hear from our final panelists, Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi. We are so grateful that you're spending this time with us. She is the founding director, PhD director, and senior scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program, and associate professor of ethnic studies at San Francisco State University. Dr. Abdulhadi, we're so glad you could be with us tonight. Thank you for being here. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, you know, as we have been forced to move our activism and discussions of Palestine online and into virtual settings, we have realized a new set of concerns around the same kind of censorship that we saw in this film, right? So particularly around big tech companies controlling the public sphere. How are the repressive tactics of the pro-occupation lobby evolving in this moment? What are you seeing?
Okay. Thank you so much, Stephanie. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that San Francisco State sits on a stolen indigenous Ohlone people's land. I also want to really thank JVP and all the sponsors for changing the platform from Zoom to Honor Justice. And I'm actually very happy that I'm there with the people from Black for Palestine who've been doing an amazing work. I want to make a couple of comments, if I may. I think that in conversation with my colleagues and comrades, Kristian and Khury, if I may, one is that I think it's really important to also remember historically that the whole consolidation of this stuff but continued and got consolidated in 2010 with the Reut Institute report of how to delegitimize Palestinian justice in Palestine activism. And that was because Zionist groups have actually got caught after the 2008-2009 Israeli war on Gaza. They didn't know what to do. They started organizing themselves, strategizing, and so on. Of course, it took a few years for that to bear fruit. But we've seen that at San Francisco State. So, I mean, the whole question of what happened at San Francisco State is a classical case. I was watching the video, and I've watched it before the 4 hours as well, the whole series. And this is San Francisco State. This is what's going on. This is what's happening at San Francisco State. So, one of the things that has happened is that everything that they mentioned there with the Israel on Campus Coalition, the Horowitz and Canary mission actually putting forces of posters against me and against my colleagues, against students and so on. All of this has happened at San Francisco State. People can look at it. They can also look at the whole question of accusations of glorification of terrorism that has been regurgitated again and again by the Amcha initiative. I've myself have confronted multiple audits as a result of that. Every single audit came out actually baseless, every single one. But the thing is that the truth doesn't really matter because the Israel lobby is very interested, as we saw in the film, very interested in creating enough noise to actually smear people in order to force us to stop and back off and actually not engage in what we're trying to do, which to me as an educator, is about justice-centered knowledge production, including Palestine. So Palestine is not really exceptionalized. Palestine is not separate. So there are a few questions that came up in the whole question of what happened at San Francisco State. One is that what happened with Zoom is that we are living in COVID-19 times. We are reliant on internet and online communication to communicate with each other. This is where the tech giants, and by the way, it's not also exceptional about Palestine, because if you look at the US government, Trump, everything else that's going on, it's also sort of like encouraging and reinvigorating, let's say, neoliberal, corporatized ways of controlling life and so on. We see it all over. We don't have time to get into it, but we can if we need to. And this is what happened with Zoom, is that Zoom has become the monopoly of all our internet communication. And as a result, Zoom has been surrendered by academic institutions, by academic curriculum, to have a veto over the content of our curriculum and the content of what we're doing. So my colleague Tomomi Kinakawa and I have organized this webinar, which is part of two series, for the fall 2019, based on what we have done in spring 2019, which was very successful. I was going to be a guest in her class, and then because of COVID-19, we actually made it all online, and the students were so excited about it. So we decided we're going to bring our 6 classes, 2 of hers, 4 of mine, together in the fall to do this. And we thought, what better way to actually bring live people to be able to speak to the students. And you and I know, and everybody know, it's very difficult to get people who are very prominent, who have very busy lives and so on, to actually agree. And they all agreed graciously. They are very well-known people, from Layla Khaled to Ronnie Casril to Laura Whitehorn to Rula Abadaha to Seko Odinga. They all agreed to actually participate. Of course, nobody even talked about money, because in the movement, people don't talk about that. People just do it voluntarily. And to be able to enable that to our students and have this amazing opportunity. The Zionist groups, however, have decided that they really wanted to silence any possibilities. And part of the reason for that, and I want to actually continue with the whole discussion that has been going on, both in the documentary, The Lobby, the longer and the shorter version that Karen has so graciously enabled us, as well as a discussion by my colleagues, both Khury and Kristian, is that there is a crisis for the Zionist movement. There is a crisis. Israel is unable to crush Palestinians. After over 100 years of colonialism, so they're unable to erase the Palestinians, and they need to erase the Palestinians in order to propagate the Zionist narrative that there is a land for people without a people for a land. Okay, so this has failed. And the Zionist groups, the Israel lobby, has actually tried with all its might, power, resources, collaboration with the U.S. government, everything that they've had, military might, everything, the deadly exchange and everything else, they failed. They failed to actually impose that. They failed to enact their own agenda. They failed to silence people. They failed to have people ask questions. So this has been the latest episode in which they actually pressured both Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube to shut down. They practice according to ACT-IL app in order to actually send thousands of emails to Facebook and YouTube to shut it down. Facebook and YouTube were also, of course, predisposed. But Zoom actually has been communicating with us. And one of the worst problems is that the university administration has actually collaborated with this, in the sense that the university president has reproduced the Zionist narrative against Palestinian narratives of resistance, resilience, and steadfastness. She repeated everything that has been going on. And also there has been a very strong collaboration between the Zionist groups on one hand, the Israel lobby, as well as the university administration, that has to do with the corporatization of education. So now Zoom has basically control and veto power over what we teach in our classrooms, over the content of our classroom, which was very problematic. The university president acquiesced and said that it's okay for Zoom because Zoom is a private company. We have to respect what they are saying. There is a lot of contradictions in that, because one is that actually Zoom, there was a webinar in which Layla Khalid spoke to the International League of People's Struggle on October 3rd, and Zoom did not stop it. Facebook and YouTube finally stopped it, but not at the beginning. And we're happy to not allow anybody to be stopped talking, but they've done that. So they actually violated their own terms. So now they're stuck. How are they going to justify their acquiescence to Zionist groups, including groups that have historically gone against us? And I'm not just talking about me and San Francisco State, but I'm talking about everywhere else. But I can also speak about my experience. For example, Stand With Us has already sued UCLA over the lecture I gave on Islamophobia on May 13, 2019, which is available online. Everybody can check and see that none of their claims actually hold true. People can also check and see that AMCHA claims that I'm glorifying terrorism and the murder of Jews, or the students are glorifying the murder of Jews, actually unfounded, and the university has already conducted multiple audits and found this is not to be true. They can go and find out what David Horowitz and the Canary Mission have done with their 4 sets of posters and so on, accusing us of being Jew hatred and engaging in anti-Semitism and so on. It's not really true. None of it is true. It's all intended to smear, bully, and intimidate in order for us to be silent and go away. Every single thing they've done. Campus Watch actually accused me of supporting Nazism, when I actually, and my students and I raised a question about a Nazi student in my class who had all these posts calling for violence against everybody, from Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, women, Jews, blacks, everybody else. And the university has basically counseled the student about freedom of speech, and they kept the students in there and so on, while they actually went against a Palestinian student who had posts when they were very young, when they were like very young, which is what Kristian has spoke about Nardin Kaswani and so on. So it's very much connected. Everything. Lawfare Project actually sued me and the university. We defeated them big time. Meanwhile, their executive director, Brooke Goldstein, who said that there should be massive punishment against anybody who opposes and criticizes Israel, must be punished, got on Fox and Friends in July 2019 and claimed that they are still suing as if there is an ongoing lawsuit. Yeah, there is a lawsuit, but we defeated you big time. So after that, I received death threats. The problem is that the university president came out saying that I support everybody's freedom of speech, as long as, even if they violate university values. And this happened the same time, this time too. The university president actually came out and reproduced all the Zionist narratives. She never spoke to me or my colleague who organized this. She could have actually talked to us because we're both colleagues. She could have said, what's going on? Why are you organizing this webinar? And what the Zionists really wanted to do was that actually silence the question of Palestinian narratives. Our intent to discuss gender and sexual justice, our intent to actually bring in, when we brought 4 people, 2 of them are actually anti-Zionist Jewish people, Ronnie Kasris from South Africa and Laura Whitehorn from New York. But the Zionist movement was not interested in talking about that, because that would undermine the whole notion of their claim that they speak for all Jews around the world. And everybody in JVP knows this is not really the case, and this is not going on. They also tried to silence the fact that one of our speakers is actually the director of the premier institute of women's studies and gender studies in the whole region, Rula Abu Dahaw, or the fact that we had included Seko Odinga, who's a very long time Black liberation fighter, who has already spoken about this, who has connected with Palestinian groups and so on, who's very much influenced in the movement, who's also talking about people who have been imprisoned, because he himself has been over 30 years in prison himself. So there are all these issues that we tried to bring together were silenced because it was not in the interest of Zionist groups to enable us to have people speak about what does it mean to have gender and resistance? What does it mean to retell history? What does it mean to educate about it, and so on? And the sad reality is that our university administration that is so corporatized went along with it. So I will just give a couple of examples. So for example, on September 14th, our university president published an op-ed in J Weekly, which is a newsletter of the Jewish Community Relations Council, which is one of the Zionist organizations in the Bay Area. And on the same day, she was actually congratulated by a main director from the Jewish Community Federation, who was exposed. The Jewish Community Federation, I think some of my colleagues spoke about that, was exposed for funding the Canary Mission, for funding Campus Watch, for funding Lawfare, for funding Horowitz, for funding all these like hate groups that are not only against Palestinians, but they're against Black liberation, they're against sanctuary, they're against women's movement. And we see the collusion with that also coming in. On September 23rd, there was a rally that was organized by the Israeli consulate in the Bay Area, which Kristian spoke about in terms of the activism of SJP at Stanford, and the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Jewish Community Federation, as well as 2 units in San Francisco State University that are supposed to actually uphold diversity and equity. This is quite concerning to all of us because on many levels, one is that actually it enables private corporations, just like the tech giant of Zoom, to have control over our own classrooms, the content of our curriculum. This is a very far-reaching implication for everybody who cares about academic freedom, especially in the age of COVID-19. The second big problem is that the university corporation actually enabled and justified what Zoom was doing by saying this is a private corporation, they have their own terms of service and so on, instead of challenging them on the notion that academic freedom is sacred and non-negotiable. We have the right to educate, to set our syllabi, to do whatever we want. 3 is that the university leadership, including the president and the provost, actually colluded with the Zionist Israel lobby in terms of reproducing the same narrative about the whole question of Palestinians being terrorists and so on and so forth, which is something that got very much dominant, especially post 9/11/2001, with the word in terror discourses, but also the whole question of actually denying us the right to be able to bring our guests and have them say what they wanted to say, which was very part of our very much deliberate organizing to talk about gender, to talk about justice, to talk about resistance, and so on. So it was really about censorship. It was about silencing, and it is something up to the movement to speak up and say, this is not something that's okay. It's not okay. If you do something like this, we're going to actually say to you exactly like the civil rights movement, exactly like the anti-apartheid movement. It's like the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. About everybody else, you do something wrong, we're not going to patronize these businesses. So we are not swayed. We're not defeated. We're going to continue. It's a very difficult situation and so on, but we're going to continue. And actually, my colleague and I, Tomomi Kinekawa, are doing the second part of our gender and sexual justice program on Monday, October 19th, with a very distinguished panel. Some of the people are actually very active in JVP. Some of the people are active. And we're also bringing Al-Qaus and Aswat from Palestine to speak. We're bringing Professor Layla Farah, who's an amazing performer from Palestine. We're bringing Heike Chopin, Judith Butler, Beverly Gisheftal. We're bringing Dean Space. We're actually going to have it's very difficult. It's trying because we're trying to do all these platforms and the university is not helping us to count alternative platforms. But we believe that this is something that we really need to educate. And we believe that this is something that the mission that we're inspired for, the spirit of 68. This is what students struck in San Francisco State. And they said, we really need to bring the community and the university together. We need to challenge education. We need to say that education is about legitimizing marginalized community. And that's what we're doing. So we hope everybody joins us. And we're very happy that we're here today. Thank you.
Everybody mark that date down. It's going to be phenomenal. We have our next online date together, and it's to that event. So we can even, folks should be able to see the link to it in the comments on YouTube. Thank you so much. Really sobering, and also, sobering to hear that experience. Thank you so much for sharing it, and also incredible to hear your thoughts about what's next for us. I wanted to finish up with just one last question from the crowd. So grateful to our 3 amazing presenters, speakers here tonight. I'd love to hear just a little final remark from each of you in response to this question from Leaf Nobody. What are some of the most effective methods you have found to refocus conversations on the struggle rather than on these manufactured spectacles we saw in the film? Khury, let's start with you and we'll go around that way.
Sure. Well, I guess I think about the fact that manufactured spectacles have just become, the daily, if not hourly, diet of people who live, in this country. I mean, that's the one thing that the president is most effective at is spectacle. That's his whole career prior to becoming the president, right? So, and despite that, well, in part because of that, I think actually a lot of people, part of the revelation that's happening for so many people is a revelation of that kind of tactic, right? Of the powerful. And so we should build on that. I mean, it's like, okay, if you saw these uprisings for justice this summer, right? And you heard the president say, we need law and order or whatever, and try to kind of redirect, and you didn't buy it, you should understand that the same people, the same institutions do a similar tactic when it comes to Palestinian struggles for justice, right? If you supported these rebellions, which the overwhelming majority of people in this country did, remarkably, right? They saw through the spectacles, then you should understand that what's happening in Palestine is also legitimate struggle and rebellion, and you should be in solidarity with that as well.
Amazing. Thank you. Kristian, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. On the manufactured spectacle end, I am thinking of last year at NSJP at the University of Minnesota, where it appears that pro-Israel actors organized a group of 3 Black women to come and claim that SJP supports slavery as a protest of the conference. And this is an example of how absurd their AstroTurf protests get in a moment of increased solidarity between oppressed people, specifically between Black and Palestinian people. In those cases, I think just the spectacle exposes itself. It's so absurd. But I recall being a young member of SJP and giving an interview and being told that, oh, you all chanted from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free at a protest. This is genocidal, and having no idea like what that meant or how to respond to it. And this is an example of a Zionist talking point that sticks, and that puts many people on the defensive. Mark Lamont Hill lost his job over this line. And so for us in the movement, I think it's our job to define for ourselves what we mean by the words that we use in our movement. The second that we let somebody else define what we say means, we lose power and we lose control of the situation. So if you're in an SJP and you're starting out the year, it might be useful just to think of what are the common phrases that we use. How can we define these in a way that's accessible to our community to point out what intifada means, or what from the river to the sea means, or even what it means to support one democratic state, for example. But we have to push through the backlashes. What Rabab was saying at the beginning, why do we even let them pay them attention? Like if we keep our minds focused on the task at hand, which is liberation for Palestine and liberation for all oppressed people in the world, then these people are nothing. But we have to be willing to stand up for ourselves and assert our own vocabulary and language and set of actions.
I love that. Thank you for that advice. That's brilliant. Rabab, how about you? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there is a couple of issues. One is that I think it's really important for us to keep in mind ideologically that Zionism is a passing phenomenon. I think people think that this has been there forever and ever. It hasn't. It's a very recent phenomenon. There have been multiple ways to understand how to fight the principal struggle against anti-Semitism before Zionism, and it will be there afterwards. And it includes all of us coming together for the indivisibility of justice, for Black lives, for indigenous lives, for brown lives, for poor people, for women, for queers, for everybody. This is the indivisibility of justice. I never ever think of Palestine as something exceptional. I really always think of Palestine as being part of the struggle of the indivisibility of justice. That's one thing. The secondly is definitely not exceptionalizing Palestine. Third is we do really need to learn. And as an educator, I went to the academy because I wanted to actually have DR in front of my name so people can listen to me, really, honestly, as an organizer. So, okay, it's hard, but I really believe that the whole question of the spirit of 68, the people who struck in 1968, the people who defied Contilpro, the people who defied all this imprisonment and harassment. And by the way, some of them are still going on today because JVP is very clear about the Deadly Exchange and the Anti-Defamation League and their role and so on. So we don't really need to rehash that. But I am very optimistic. I'm very optimistic that what is going on today is really indicative of the failure of Israel and its lobby to silence us. And that is why bullies are going to get nastier. They lash out. They do not accept defeat. They're going to continue to try to punish us and so on. But I think we really need to think about the power of the movement. I think we need to think about the love we have for each other. I think we really need to think about how we protect each other, how we care for each other, how we build with each other, how we kind of when the Black uprisings happen, of course, that's what you work on. That's what you work on. That's what you really need to do. I mean, this is really when Standing Rock happens, that's what you do. You support. You stand up. When the Tree of Life synagogue gets attacked, we support. This is really, it's a question of principles, a question of justice. It is a very long-term thing. And we're in it. It's going to be very difficult for the time being because they are vicious. They're nasty. They have Trump and company. They have white supremacy behind them. But honestly, we have the truth and we have justice on our side. So I'm very encouraged. I'm not giving up. And I'm very happy that I'm here with all of you, with Khury and Kristian, and you, Stephanie, and Karen, and JVP, and Samantha. I think the future is ours. We just need to be steadfast. We need to remember resilience. We need to reverse these discourses and challenge them. And we just need to speak the truth. And I think the future is ours.
I'm emotional. Thank you. Thank you for that. I needed that. Thank you all three for just a truly inspiring, heartening, beautiful evening. I've learned so much. I feel so steadied and clear about the road ahead. I'm grateful to Karen who cut this film together, and to the three of you, and to our co-sponsors. I'll just quickly rename so that everybody, if you don't know these orgs, follow them, give them money, give them your support. Palestine Legal, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Studies at SFSU, Institute for Policy Studies, Adala Justice Project, Center for Constitutional Rights, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, Palestinian Youth Movement, National Students for Justice in Palestine, and US ACBI. Thank you all for sponsoring. Thank you all for being here. Hundreds of us tonight. The future is ours. Such gratitude, such a full heart. And thank you all. Have a beautiful evening. And